All right, so we are at the top of the hour. I always like this part because I do feel like people are actually coming in the room, as if we were walking in a seminar room. Remember back in the day when but we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing. So I'm not gonna complain. So, Rodrigo, I'm gonna step away, just mute myself, and the floor is all yours.
Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good noon, wherever you're finding us from uh, across Canada. My name is Rodrigo Nero Perez, and I'm an assistant professor here in the School of Earth, Environment, and Society at McMaster University, and I'm also one of the committee members for the STLHE Equity Committee, and I'm really happy to introduce the wonderful speakers and seminar that we have lined up as part of the STLHE Equity Committee, Equity and in the Classroom series. But before I begin, I would like to just acknowledge that I know one of the wonderful things about STELI is that people are joining us all across what we call Canada, so that we might be situated in many different places. For Renata, Maddie, and myself, I know we are located in the city of Hamilton in Southern Ontario. And I just want to acknowledge that for us, as well as for anybody else who's joining us from Hamilton, we are currently sitting in the traditional territories of the Erie Neutral Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas on the land covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. For those of you who might not be familiar with this Wampum Belt Covenant, it is an agreement between Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe that is meant to set a precedent on how we share the resources around the Great Lakes, and particularly for those who are from Ontario on Cootes Paradise and Western Lake Ontario, where the dish with one spoon signify that we take only what we need and leave
Added
for
to my list of
others.
Zoom sends.
As we're thinking about, especially with what's going on with climate change, I think the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant provides an incredibly effective and good way that we can think about climate and resources in the environment, not just in Ontario, but all across Turtle Island and Ayabalia. I do just want to say that one of the topics that we'll be thinking about, in particularly in this webinar, that our wonderful speakers are going to talk about, is how to also make classrooms, wherever we find them and wherever we are, safe for Black, Indigenous, and racialized students. And just keeping in mind that, for example, I am an immigrant settler from Peru and in South America, and I think there's a lot of work that many of us who come from immigrant backgrounds have to do in recognizing the lands that we're in and how to be in community with our Indigenous peers and how that comes to play as educators. So without further ado, I would like to introduce two of our wonderful speakers who are going to give us a webinar called Learning in Color, Building Safer Classrooms for Black, Indigenous, and Racialized Students. And this seminar is part of the series Equity and in the Classroom, where we showcase within STELI inclusive practices in higher education, teaching, and learning with and for everyone. In this series, presenters engage participants in a number of issues related to equity and inclusion in both the curriculum and classroom practices.
Just
Okay, I was
muted
muted. Okay.
yourself.
Yep, no worries. I was just going to say that please be on the lookout for further information from the STELI Equity Committee at the end of this webinar, where you'll be able to learn about other upcoming events and also stay in contact. I am very privileged and honored to know our two speakers who are very co-conspicuous friends and allies in a lot of the work that happens here at McMaster University. And I would want to introduce Renata Hall, who is a PhD candidate, published in Black Feminist Scholar, who is also a Woman of Distinction 2022 awardee of the YWCA Hamilton, who is the co-creator of the Learning in Color digital platform that you'll all learn about, and who is currently the Inclusion and Anti-Racism Education Manager at McMaster University. Renata lives all things social justice through her counseling, teaching, and research pursuits. She loves building community connections, challenging the status quo, and amplifying the voices of the margins across Hamilton and the GTA. Thank you, Renata, for being here and for accepting our invitation. Lovely seeing you. And our second panelist, we got Maddie Bruckman, who is also a PhD candidate and a Vanier Scholar in the School of Social Work here at McMaster University. Her research and practice experience and community organizing initiatives have been in anti-violence work with men, especially in exploring the links between gender-based and sexual violence prevention, anti-carceral feminisms, and engaging men. Maddie has been recognized for her academic excellence and community leadership, also as a Young Woman of Distinction Award for the YWCA Hamilton, and the President's Award for Excellence in Student Leadership here in McMaster, as well as a Wilson Leadership Scholar Award. So we got two awesome scholars, practitioners, and who are going to lead us in this seminar. And I will stop talking. Thank you both. And thank you everyone also for being here with us this afternoon or morning.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo, and hello, everybody. I hope you are all doing well. As mentioned, my name is Renata, and I am joined by my colleague, Maddie. So give me 2 seconds. I'm just going to get the presentation up and going and make sure technology is going to cooperate with us, I hope. Perfect. Am I able to get like a thumbs up from someone that you can actually see what we are presenting? Awesome. All right. So as mentioned, my name is Renata Hall. I'm joined by Maddie, and we are here to talk to you about a research project that we engaged in that then stimulated a multimedia resource platform for educators. And we think of educators in a very broad term. So educators could be teaching assistants, postdoctoral fellows, tenured professors, or early career scholars. But we also see students and peers as educators in the classroom as well, in building some practical tools and bridges to stimulating safety and equity in the classroom, predominantly for racialized students. And so we're happy to not only sprinkle in a bit of the project itself and how we got to the multimedia resource page, but how this has then created a platform for Maddie and I to actually consult with deans, with departmental heads, faculty leaders, and with other higher education institutions on beginning to weave in tools of anti-oppression, inclusive pedagogy, and safety in the classroom based off of the data that we derived from this project. So I'm going to toss it over to Maddie to kind of give us a little bit of an overarching intro, and we're going to show you a fun video from our page. But Maddie, yes, to you first.
Thank you so much. Just thank you to Rodrigo for the lovely introduction. Thank you to Juan and Anne and everybody for inviting us. We're so excited. Renee and I have been working on this project for several years now, and it's been a while since we've had the chance to do something like this. So it's fun to be back in the saddle. As Renee said, we're going to start with a brief video from the website, but I just wanted to alert folks, we're going to try to wrap up our speaking portion around 2:45, 2:50 to have enough time for discussion. Renee and I are both a little bit long-winded, so we will try to check each other if we find ourselves going down rabbit holes. And then we just ask that if you have any questions, just hold them to the end so we can get through the content. It's a little bit hard in a webinar space to answer and attend to questions while we're also trying to get through content. So please feel free to pop any questions in the chat and we'll make sure that we get to them at the end. But with that, Renee, do you want to play the video? This is our introduction.
As a student of color, the first day of university always comes with mixed feelings. You're excited but nervous, uncertain yet hopeful. Like most of us, you dream of finding a group that understands you, of finding your purpose, at least for the next 4 years. But the reality for the student of color is more unstable than expected. Racial isolation, microaggressions, limited support, and invalidation or outright dismissal frequently becomes the narratives of their school experience. Being the only Black student in class, well, I feel like I'm in harm's way, like I'm in an unsafe environment. There's absolutely no support for people like me, and the things my peers were saying, it all made me feel really uncomfortable. I began to question the comments of other students, of faculty, of coworkers, even my own family, and I think it was really underpinned by this constant feeling of being unsafe. And I was angry too. Angry that I even had to feel unsafe to begin with. If I'm like, no, that's not my experience, or at least not mine, and that's not how I see it at all, then I feel like I have to justify myself to people with my life story. And all this unnecessary disclosure, in order to educate, it can be really emotionally taxing. The resounding message is, I don't want future students to go through what I'm going through. And so we invite professors, teaching assistants, administrators, and students to use the site to aid in strategizing ways across the continuum of the pedagogy, to partner with students of color, to hear them, see them, and acknowledge their experiences within the institution. Being willing to have this conversation is a first step, and that can be liberating across all touch points in academia.
Awesome. So this video, we were so fortunate to have animated by Celine Freud. They did such a phenomenal job. And then Renee got to show off her vocal stylings, which was also great. I hadn't seen it in a while, so it was nice to watch it again. But that, I think, is a really great summative video that we actually put at the beginning of the website for folks to engage in as an introduction to both the research project and then also what we ended up producing with Learning in Color as a resource for all educational shareholders to think about accountability and building safer classrooms, regardless of the position that you occupy in that space. So with that, we will get started on our kind of like origins of the project, how we kind of approached this conversation. As I said, we really kind of hope to be succinct in this part because I think a lot of people are familiar with this literature, have started doing this kind of thinking, and we really hope to get to the kinds of tangible strategies and skills that the resource is really emphasizing. But we have a really phenomenal professor at McMaster, Emil Joseph, who always says you really have to understand the complexity of the issue before you move to a solution to make sure that your responses are informed. And I think that's a really foundational pillar that we built this project upon, where so often people want to move to, okay, I know that there's an issue, but what do I do? I just want to know what are specific skills or strategies I can deploy to, engage in anti-racist pedagogy or teaching and learning. And really, we have to sit with the history and we have to sit with the complexity of the issue before we go to solutions to make sure that our responses are informed, are cognizant of the reality and the context, and are really concerned with the thing that we really cared about, which was student experience, because we know it's so significant to how the classroom is set up. But just as a bit of context, we are situated at McMaster University, but I'm sure everybody on this call has their own experience and their own thoughts about what this looks like at your own institution and the institutional landscape as we approach anti-racist work. But at McMaster specifically, there were extensive discussions for decades before we undertook this project that we really wanted to make sure that we cited and credited as being formative for our thinking. In particular, Dr. Arig Al-Shaba, who was our former Vice Provost of Equity Inclusion and then sadly left us for, I believe, UBC, so we miss her all the time. But she did a really extensive report in 2020 about McMaster's commitments to inclusive excellence. And we actually were able to comb through some notes and see that some of the first iterations of anti-racist discussions at McMaster were happening in the 80s. Same with conversations about sexual and gender diversity, indigeneity, accessibility, Islamophobia, and xenophobia. So that foundation was really important for us to think about, because so often we are like, okay, we're much farther ahead than we were in 1980. So is this conversation something we still need to renew and reaffirm our commitments to? And in our work, we really pointed to the realities that despite maybe some aesthetic changes or institutional shifts, there are still systemic issues around racism in academia that just kept coming forward regardless of discipline, regardless of institution. So just wanted to provide that bit of context for the higher education positioning. But if we go to the next slide, we also engaged in a literature review because we really wanted to understand the breadth of scholarship that was going to underpin and inform our approach to this work. And as many folks on this call probably know, there is extensive scholarship examining Western Eurocentrism or white supremacy being embedded in Western academic institutions. So regardless of our good intentions, we know that the history of Canadian education is often rooted in settler colonialism, in anti-Black racism, in Islamophobia. And often it's now going normalized and unnamed. It makes it what's so difficult about identifying these patterns is its ability to go without naming. So in our position, we occupy, a social work position. So we were also thinking about practitioners, but So often in social work education, the assumption in the literature is that the practitioner is operating from a position of whiteness. And this was something that came up in conversation in our classes, and something that Renee and I actually engaged in pretty extensive discussion throughout our undergraduate degree and then into our master's degree. We've been in school together for a very long time. And that was something that was pretty common regardless of discipline. We had the same kinds of reflections from folks in poli-sci and the sciences, that the assumption is if you're a practitioner, if you're an academic, you're operating from a position of privilege or whiteness. And that normalization of that position often makes racialized students feel unrepresented, excluded, as if they don't belong. So it's even embedded in the pedagogy before we even get into the facilitation of how you operate and how you create a classroom space. And then a couple of other issues that came up pretty extensively in the literature were racial microaggressions. So for folks who want a quick working definition, that just refers to commonplace, daily, everyday, implicit or explicit signals. So that can be verbal, behavioral, environmental. And what they do is they communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative insults targeting a person or group, often those who are in protected positions. So people in marginalized identities, those who are racialized, disabled, queer, trans, etc. And some of the major kinds of themes underpinning racial microaggressions was that they often precipitate what they call difficult dialogues or contentious topics. So before you dive into a conversation about racism, somebody might already be engaging in racial microaggressions that then create the space where that conversation is targeted toward a very specific identity, excludes specific identities. And they often happen before we even know it. That's something that we saw quite a bit in our undergraduate education. We took an anti-oppressive perspectives course, and on the first day, we were already hearing racial microaggressions, and it was already setting the tone for the remainder of the course, which I'm sure a lot of folks can resonate with. And then we also know that safety and belongingness is tied into this conversation. We often hear this term safer spaces or safe space. So we dove into a lot of literature about that, and we found that the vast majority of people, unsurprisingly, find safety in a classroom really conducive to success in their learning. And safe class traits usually are characterized by the ability to be honest, it's non-judgmental, it's open, you can take risks, instructors step in when necessary, there are respectful ground rules, and we're comfortable with conflict. We don't shy away from it because we know it can produce something effective. And then unsafe class traits are peers are judgmental, they're biased, they're apathetic, the instructor doesn't engage or seems to gloss over key issues, and then students end up feeling either really disengaged or feel like they can't participate because it doesn't feel safe enough to do so. And there's a really interesting conversation that, again, is a rabbit hole that I won't fall down, but safety was characterized differently depending on the students' identities. So students from dominant positions were like, I don't want to be canceled. I don't want to be judged for saying something wrong. I don't want to be judged for maybe my family engaging in racist behavior or me being raised that way. Whereas students from marginalized positions were like, I don't want to have to educate my peers. I don't want to be called slurs. I don't want to be excluded for speaking up. And it was a very fundamental difference. And that's where Renee and I started to pursue this idea of there's a difference between discomfort and unsafety. And that's part of the instructor or the educator's job, is to tease out those differences and create a space where we can have honest and open conversations about that, no matter how difficult it might be. And then the last two pieces are a lot of instructors that we have spoke with anecdotally feel like they don't have the resources on hand or the knowledge to facilitate safer spaces or build that. And then there's a lack of disaggregated data. So McMaster collects some data on retention and recruitment of marginalized students, but we don't have the specifics. We don't have that pulled apart. We don't have a lot of the context. So we pursued a qualitative study to try to find some of that narrative context. And I'll pass it to Renee as we proceed.
Mm-hmm. And so that narrative context we were actually looking for would be somewhat informed if we're thinking about traditional kind of scans of environment of somewhat of a bit of a needs assessment, but it's also underpinned by critical race theorist methods to uncovering, I think, the narratives of people's lived experiences on the day-to-day and how systems and structures and institutions such as higher education could be perpetuating racism very covertly, whether it be systemically academically or interpersonally. But we'll get into that in just a bit. So with all of this literature and background that Maddie had mentioned, we already knew that there were core retention issues for students of color within academics, despite higher education's attempts to engage in things like cohort, recruitment, or streamlining applications or supplementary, kind of document streams that you can apply for as like a Black or racialized, a Latinx, student. Whether once you get into the institution, there's a very different experience that is waning on the success of students of color, both academically, but also personally. And so how some of these things were materializing day to day, I'll tell a little bit of an anecdote through my own experiences of being a student of color and that of many others that I spoke to during my master's when I was leading a caucus group called United in Color. It was a group for students of color to come together and share their experiences in academia. So we see these things in very covert or insidious ways, both interpersonally or systemically. A denial of care, often for racialized students in the classroom or in broad systems and structures. So this denial of care can come in the form of, perhaps there is a racial microaggression that was issued in a classroom and an instructor is not ill-equipped to actually interrupt that harm. Sometimes they actually perpetuate a stereotype or a microaggression. And when a student of color often, steps up and tries to advocate for themselves, communities that they're a part of, or rewrite some of the misconceptions that are in people's stereotypical discourse, they often face reprisal. As a result of that. And that reprisal comes in the form of social isolation. Sometimes it would be punishment in terms of grades, or even a lack of opportunity when it comes to mentorship, shadowing with faculties, like research assistantships or engaging in projects, that are often afforded to other students. And that kind of goes into differential treatment as well, too. So this differential treatment can be interpersonally, whether it's amongst white peers. So one of the things that came up in my experience and many other student of color's experiences is that you are often the one of one in a classroom. So you could count literally on your fingertips how many people of color were in the room, right? And that already created a differential treatment on the basis of belongingness, how I can use my voice in this space. Do I have choices to engage in my academic environment? What do I need to access? Who do I need to access? Can I access it at the same rate? And then back to this idea of safety. Is this place psychologically safe for me to engage? And that differential treatment was not only interpersonally from peers and from instructors, but also that differential treatment is embedded in policy. When a student does come forward and say disclose harm, there is not a lot of policy that will slurp up language such as racial microaggressions and substantiate that as a case in a classroom, right? To give students care options. A lack of cultural attentiveness. When we think about the centering of whiteness in the pedagogy, that's boiled down to everything that we do. Curriculum design, readings that we decide to integrate into courses, the ways that we grade and assess folks, right? And so with a lack of global perspective and even racialized perspective, racial scholars and any study or subject matter, in addition to the lack of racialized scholars that are making up a space, students are unable to actually see themselves reflected in academics, or at least even their passions and interests in communities that they may want to work with. And lastly, contraction politics. So that's a phrase coming from the healthcare sector that has now been used in a loose way to say that people are blamed for whatever issue that they're going through. So often when students of color are trying to articulate, my academic performance is being impacted because of a lack of safety that sometimes they're unable to even language, right? Or I am experiencing this microaggression. They're actually blamed for being overly sensitive, disorganized, not engaged with the classroom, rather than perhaps an instructor or an administrator actually seeing the environment that is creating this vacuum of harm and therefore trauma, which we'll later define in this presentation, that has the ability to impact students of color's academic performance, readiness, and even engagement. And so knowing that this was my experience and the experience of many other students of color, while white students were often having a very different experience in the classroom, enlightening experiences, being able to see themselves, we went on a little bit of a journey to see what are other informal research projects that have been done within the school to try and illuminate the narratives of students of color, and what has the administration done to respond to these things. within the School of Social Work specifically, there had been two previous attempts before we utilized United in Color to mobilize this project that's attempted to narrativize and bring some disaggregation to the conversation of student of color's experiences. One was the Race Report in 2017, and another one was the Suggestion Box. Both were stimulated by students of color themselves, going through their own experiences, trying to create change. By the time we had seen this, and there was, I will say, maybe a boil up of some experiences within the School of Social Work that were causing a very clear racial divide in the classroom. As I was leading, United in Color, Maddie was also noticing this divide, and we kind of paired together and said, how do we begin to articulate this beyond a suggestion box or a report where this can often be seen as single stories or single person issues, to actually paint the landscape that this is not just a School of Social Work issue, this is happening across the university to many intersectional, identities. It's also important to note that the two people that engaged in the Race Report and the Suggestion Box were also Black women. And so that's why I say it's easy to boil this down to a single person kind of issue, rather than actually recognizing that this is not just Black female identifying students going through this experience, that there are many other intersections as well too. And so we decided to adopt a formal research project, knowing that academics loves research. And so, as I mentioned, we underpinned our research through, critical race theory, anti-oppressive perspectives that look to bring together an anti-racist pedagogical perspectives that asks us to bring together intersectional identities across, racial identity, across disciplines, in the university, to begin to unveil what is our collective kind of lived experience of covert and sometimes overt racism in the pedagogy, name where it's coming from, right? And then begin to develop what is our counter story. So a counter story is something intimate to critical race, theory. It seeks to unveil what is the true actually identity, aptitudes, strengths of students of color, and how can that actually be mobilized and used by the pedagogy to undo some harm and drive anti-racist pedagogical kind of design and work. So ultimately, we had a focus group of 10 Black, Indigenous, and racialized students from across McMaster faculties. We had social sciences, engineering, medicine, and more. And we began to ask questions related to participants' experience in the classroom, feelings of safety and belongingness in relation to the administration, their peers, and faculty members and instructors. And then we ended it knowing that critical race theory asks us to think very pointedly and collectively about social transformation. We asked, what can they do, right? So we're not leaving the conversation of, these are our experiences and we're just being harmed. From these articulations, what can the pedagogy actually do? And let's break that down by primary audiences that you feel need to have their own kind of nuanced conversations, efforts, reflections, action first, before it can build into a broad kind of higher institutional goal. And so the three audiences were white students and peers, faculty, we said loosely, and that, or educators, and that will put anyone in a teaching position. So that could be teaching assistants, sessional instructors, postdoctoral students, tenured faculty members, and then the administration itself, which was the third, audience. And that is getting us into kind of procedure, policy, those who might be in student front facing roles, but they have a staff position like intake offices, right? And so on and so forth. So here are some of the themes that then shape, I think, the implications that we would love to share with you folks. And I'm going to toss it back to you, Maddie.
Yes. So this is just a quick overview of the major themes that we want to just briefly touch upon before we move into the more tangible strategies. But we'll go through each of these. So Renee, if you want to hit the next slide, I'll do the first three, and then Renee will take us through into discussions of racial trauma. So the first issue that we noticed was that this was a systemic issue. There is often an urge to hyper individualize it, or say it's just a result of this one class or this one student or or this one interaction with an instructor. When we had these conversations with Black, Indigenous, and racialized students, we noticed trends across disciplines and across faculties that really point to the systemic nature of it. So we have a quote here from a conversation that happened in the focus group, but there were just a number of examples that students discussed where faculty often kind of position themselves as ill-equipped or inappropriate to be the one to address a racial tension coming up in the classroom, and choosing not to interfere because maybe that learning will happen through dialogue, and rather than that, it actually was harm that was happening, and then students ended up developing a distrust or a mistrust of their instructors. There was also, again, as we alluded to earlier, a centrality of whiteness in terms of who's represented in the readings, whose theories are we talking about, what scholars are we engaging with, are we treating lived experience and knowledge as illegitimate or unnecessary, when in fact it often positions us in our relationship with learning and with engaging with pedagogy. And then also there was a bit of a lack of accountability as well, where instructors are often burdened with a number of things that they have to navigate, but there was an unwillingness or a disinterest in updating syllabi to integrate more recent literature, or invite guest speakers in who have lived experience, who can speak to a theory that they have less familiarity with. So that systemic focus ended up being a major underpinning of the rest of the research. The next theme was unrecognized and uncompensated labor. This was a very major one that so many students disclosed experiences of, and that just basically refers to any extra work that largely marginalized students have to undertake outside of paid roles or outside of their position just as a student in the class, where they are often asked to support their peers, intervene when harm is happening to themselves or to another student, and then often offer solutions. So there are so many anecdotes I could bring up about in the School of Social Work where harm would happen, and then a student would speak up about it, and the instructor would go, okay, so what do I do about it? What do you think I should do? And that's not the student's job, and the student often felt like it was an unfair burden placed upon them. Renee herself has tons of anecdotes and experiences. I can think of one off the top of my head that was quite major for informing this project in terms of like supporting students through their emotional reactions. So we're talking about white supremacy and white students taking that really personally, and then going to a racialized student and saying, I didn't know it was this bad. And like the racialized student having to navigate that emotion and that burden as well. And this was something that happened both inside and outside the classroom. It's not something that just stayed there and then they could go home and not think about it. It's something that often followed them home, which I think has a major implication for what Renee will discuss around the racial trauma piece. The next theme was around just experiences of harm, and there were so many that were discussed that we all kind of had to sit with as co-researchers, because for Renee and our research assistants who were also racialized, so many of them like had shared experiences, and it was just something we really wanted to center before we moved into a solution. We really have to acknowledge the harms that have and continue to happen in the classroom, especially when students are going with a lot of excitement and a lot of eagerness and a lot of passion, and sometimes that's stamped out by even one really poor experience. So these are just a couple of examples that students discussed. Tokenization, so as Renee indicated, often being the only Black woman in class and then being put on the spot to speak to all facets of anti-Black racism or anti-Blackness. Microaggressions either being intentional or unintentional and being quite normalized in any kind of classroom discussion. Devil's advocate is a really big one that I think a lot of folks on this call have heard, where it's just somebody trying to be a contrarian, not for the intent to foster learning and conversation that's healthy and appropriate, but really just to bother people, to incite debate. And we often see that devil's advocate happening specifically around questioning racialized students' experiences, and making them do the labor of explaining that racism exists because they themselves have experienced it. As we already mentioned, lack of intervention from instructors. Reactivity versus proactivity is a major one. So often we always had this conversation, Renee and I, where it was like, why does something have to go so horribly wrong before we think about this thing? And there's just some things and some steps that we can take to mitigate that risk as much as possible, knowing that conflict may still arise, but there's a way we can respond in a different avenue, and then centering Western epistemology, not treating that counter narrative that Renee discussed as legitimate and as a serious form of knowledge that we should care and pay attention to.
Mm-hmm. And just one quick thing on the reactivity versus proactivity. Again, it kind of goes back to an issue or a lack of care for racialized students. Maddie and I have also sessionally instructed many courses at McMaster and other institutions, and I think we can all appreciate that there'll be things that happen throughout the semester that we're like, ooh, that was a learning curve for me. That was a blunder. And often we just leave it there at the end of the semester, thinking it may be a cohort issue, a per semester issue. Perhaps I was just off my game that day as an instructor. And we don't actually think about not only the rippling or material, like the rippling effects of this in students' lives outside of the course, but we don't utilize that experience and that learning curve to think proactively about the next time I teach this course. If I'm going to center this reading or engage in this dialogue again, how can I make sure that this scenario doesn't reinvite itself, especially when we cannot predict the ever-changing geopolitical landscape that students are living through, that they then bring into the classroom that can take innocent questions and discussions or reflections or activities we're trying to do in the classroom to a completely different place, okay? So altogether, these themes really revealed, I think, one of the most resounding, themes of our project, and has already been substantiated by literature as well as psychology, called the long-term emotional impacts, of being race-based trauma. So race-based trauma has many, many terms. It's also been broadened to encapsulate other intersectional identities outside of race. Another interchangeable term is oppression-based trauma. And this is when you are experiencing long-term or even little micro moments on a day-to-day or one egregious experience of needing to defend yourself, a community you're a part of, your identity, or your experiences, by product of being a marginalized identity, that leads to a form of PTSD when unaddressed and kind of normalized. And this creates an emotional impact within students that drives hopelessness, invisibility, isolation, disengagement, anxiety. It bolsters feelings of imposter syndrome in the classroom, but can then also, in tandem, if not given some support, begin to then materialize in a physical way in the classroom, where students begin to isolate themselves. They're not handing in work as much as they used to. There's a decreased attendance or concentration, or a lack of community and cultivation. And often when we then begin to add racial stereotypes to this, we begin to view that student, that behavioral change we notice, as, a student who is not up to par with the rest of the class. They're not apt, to be in this space. They're lazy. They're coming up with excuses, rather than actually seeing perhaps the student is traumatized by the environment that's been normalized here, because there is perhaps so much harm. And so a bit of a slide here on race-based traumatic stress. I really encourage you folks to look it up. It's been widely studied and written about in comparison to a few years ago. And so race-based traumatic stress, as I've already mentioned, is a form of PTSD. And it can sometimes also be very hard to spot, because people of color, much like many other marginal identities, are very good at something called buffering or masking their harm. Right. And so it's very rare, especially in an unsafe environment, that someone's going to come up to you and even have the language to say, I'm experiencing race-based traumatic stress, or even feel safe enough to disclose that. It's often hidden in some of these physical manifestations, as I mentioned, that disengagement, a sudden drop in poor performance, right? Not showing up, anymore, obsessive needs sometimes for high performance, or being kind of like what we can see as the round noser to overcome perhaps stereotypes that have been thrusted on them as not belonging in the classroom or not being smart enough. And if we're able to identify this and give it a language, hopefully we can begin to delve deeper into what is the need of the student as it relates to safety in the classroom, and begin to materialize that change. So how we proceeded from the study was taking up all of these themes and deciding to create a resource for the institution that then frames our implications, which we're going to use the rest of these like 10-ish minutes to talk about, okay? So we created something called Learning in Color, which is that multimedia digital platform. And we created a repository of resources, questions, activities for now 4 different audiences. Recognizing that one of the themes was racial traumas, we created a whole tab just for racialized students to say, is this your experience? let us validate and affirm it for you. Here's language to, did somebody say that remark in class? That's a devil's advocacy argument. Being able to give you an articulation to advocate for yourself within the system, defend yourself, or maybe just internally affirm your experiences, especially when I know myself and many others would often go through these covert harms in the classroom, and we're gaslighting ourselves. We're questioning, did this even happen? A whole tab to say your reality is real, and here's how you care for yourself so you can continue to shine and be excellent in academics, but also here's some tools to if you do want to kind of advocate yourself in the system, here's some tools, here's some language, here's some intake offices or things to think about, and how to assess your own safety. Again, we have a tab for white students and allies, beginning to educate what is racism, how it occurs in the classroom, how you may be perpetuating it, even though you think you are on a learning journey, right? And how do we then begin to shift your ideologies towards that of allyship while also engaging in learning, co-learning in the classroom, and being able to recognize and unpack privilege and how that actually creates many isms in the classroom. A similar space was created for TAs and instructors, where we're beginning to define what is safe space creation. How do you actually do that? And how does racism, covert racism, your inability to interrupt it and ways you may be perpetuating it, have an impact on this idea of safe space? And what are the pedagogical barriers that you need to be mindful of in creating change so you can move from reactivity to proactivity in your curriculum design and classroom creation? And lastly, a tab for administrators. So this is talking about institutional racism and what we can look at in terms of our pedagogical processes, policies, hiring, student service design, and further suggestions. And this was really informed, kind of going back to, Abigail Sheba's framework around equity, diversity, and inclusion called Towards Inclusive Excellence. In the pedagogy, it's thinking through equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism in the fabric of everything we do. So institutional commitment and capacity, that's a pillar to think about as you as a leader in a space. Who are you accountable to in the classroom, right? What are your governance structures? Do you have feedback loops to understand the needs, of students? How do you utilize that data? How do you utilize data from even your course reviews and advocate within the system to ask more questions beyond, did you just like my course, right? To get to the actual understanding of safety in the environment you're creating. When we think about academic content and context, this is the context of your teaching and learning. Are we globalizing that curriculum? Are we driving accommodation, in what we're doing? Is there a diversity of speakers or at least thought points and perspectives that we're able to inject into this space? Whose voices are we actually centering, whether it be physically in the classroom or ideologically? When we think about interactional capabilities and climate, personal competencies in interpersonal behaviors or intergroup relations is asking yourself as an instructor, am I actually able to temper when the environment is turning unsafe? How do I know how people are relating to one another? And that's going into a space of perhaps discrimination and harassment or whatever it may be. What competencies do I actually need to build in order to interrupt that harm, which is probably trainings, trauma-informed approaches, trauma-informed pedagogies, handling contentious conversations, things of that sort. And lastly is also asking yourself, who is in the classroom and what do they need in relation to access and success? And a more important question to ask yourself is, who is not here and why? Right? Begin to problematize that and ask yourselves, how do I actually engage, with the community that is my classroom, not in a way that has power over my students, but trying to work with them in collaboration to create things like community guidelines that we can fall back on if something goes wrong, right? And create a consensus. How do we also remember that a syllabi is a contract between a student and their instructor? So if a contract, both parties need to agree, right? How do we create that a negotiable open access experience, especially for racialized students, so they can give you suggestions on how to see themselves in what you're doing? So here are the last few kind of tips we're going to throw at you around where you might start. We're going to start first ideologically. If this is some of the first times you've ever been exposed to subject matter like this, we would encourage you to start thinking from within before acting as we began this presentation. And then we're going to end our last kind of 2-3 slides on what can you actually do then physically after you've done some reflection in your classroom. And we'll kind of draw back to this 4-pillar framework where we can to kind of slot things along the way and hopefully a strategy or manner that feels organized. So I'll toss it over to Maddie to start with some ways that we can self-reflect as instructors or educators.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, I think where it always can necessarily begin is in self-reflections and self-assessments. So, we put and kindly put the link to the Learning in Color site. I also put the link to the PressBook version. We had to migrate it there just for accessibility concerns and then also for sustainability. So, please feel free to peruse that at your leisure. But we included some examples of self-assessments that you can actually engage with, cited sources that have done a lot of thinking around this in a really foundational way. And I think starting with that and starting with your own kinds of assumptions and biases about how you conceptualize safety, your own experience of being a student or being in an educational space and what you found worked or didn't work. Even going back to examples, as Renee said, of I tried something out and it really didn't work out, and I need to like dig into why it didn't. I am guilty of this. Sometimes when something goes wrong, I just never want to think of it again. But really taking the time to think about what was I going for, what was my intention, what was the impact, because being accountable for that impact is really key for building safety. Something that we also really found that was a really necessary conversation, we write about it quite extensively in the press book, is this conversation of white fragility and white victimhood. And we kind of pushed back against that and really wanted to also talk about white rage. Because so often we might be experiencing feelings of like guilt or shame or feel blamed, just for being in a privileged position, just for being born white. And that fragility is often something that we picture as like tears, as crying, as being emotional. But so often, especially, I saw a question in the chat that I'm just dying to talk about, but we'll get there when we get there, is just in the current climate where there's a real threat and an attack on EDIA, that we know that white fragility actually manifests often as white rage, where it ends up being violence. It ends up being either physical threats of violence or even ideological threats to institutional initiatives that are trying to create safety. So we really need to reaffirm that understanding before we can move forward, because those feelings are normal, to feel defensive or to feel emotional or to feel uncomfortable. But we really have to think about what foundational belief is that challenging and where does that belief come from? On very, difficult for me in a lot of ways.
Oh,
And
sorry,
then,
Maddie.
oh,
Maddie,
am
you
I
froze
cutting
for a
out?
little, yeah, just a little second,
Oh
but I think we
no.
got you back. Yeah, so keep
Okay,
going.
sorry. It always does this. As soon as I'm like cooking, they cut me out. It's my internet. But yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that piece of those feelings are normal and we can think about them and engage with them, but we really can't let them prevent us from moving toward the kinds of initiatives that end up building safety, as difficult as it may be. Renee, if you want to hit the next slide. We can maybe toss this back and forth, but these are just a couple of other tips in terms of, again, starting at the micro level and then building into the more systemic institutional interventions, and using our positionality as educators to make a difference. So that self-education that we talked about, doing those self-assessments, doing those self-reflections, looking for those resources because we know that they're out there. For example, at McMaster, we have Asia, who's in charge of anti-racist pedagogies at our Teaching and Learning Center, and she's a great resource like that we often turn to be like, okay, I want to rethink this thing in my course. Like, can you help me do so? And there's people often at institutions that are equipped to do that work and paid to do that work. Also addressing gaps and issues through intentional curriculum design and evaluation. So that can be decentering whiteness and integrating voices and perspectives of marginalized persons. For me, in my own sessional instruction, I try to like draw on podcasts. I try to draw on articles written by grassroots organizers, just to give a perspective, because we know there was a research study published, I think last year, that indicated that racialized people are less likely to be published in peer-reviewed journals than their white counterparts. So we know that there's a bias even in the system of treating what knowledge as legitimate or as academic, and creating space for students to also look for those resources and integrate them where appropriate, because so much of that learning around anti-racism comes from people in the community who are boots on the ground doing the work. And then Renee, do you want to maybe finish us off with the other two pieces?
Yeah. I did want to zoom back to this addressing of gap and issues through intentional curricular design and evaluation, especially in the landscape we're in where there are threats to EDI. There is now a push more than ever where data and evidence needs to be at the center of what we're doing. And so in my role and kind of utilizing my hat as manager of inclusion and anti-racism within the Equity and Inclusion Office here at McMaster, I'm now scrambling, going to our like institutional research centers, asking them, what data do you have about the demographics of our students and their experiences, so we can utilize this to bolster why we need to continue to fund particular initiatives, why we may need to start new initiatives, and where we might need to justify perhaps amalgamating initiatives together, or cutting our losses if particular things aren't working. Especially also not only the threat of EDI, but we're also in a period as a collection of higher institutions of fiscal restraint. And so often EDI initiatives, race-based initiatives, safe space creation for students of color and many other marginal identities are the first to kind of get cut or guillotined when there's budgetary restraints. And so data. And I can't emphasize this enough, not only on a classroom level, don't wait for your ICAP reviews, try to see if we can make this a proactive systemic engagement with data, and partner with your faculty or your department or your dean to understand the experiences of students further and utilize that to make changes in curricular design. And as Maddie has mentioned, there's so many folks on campus, on many campuses, that are just underutilized, that are here to help you do the work. And there's also self-paced modules and things that can be engaged in if we decide to shift our priorities to do this learning. And that's why we start with ideological or reflections, because we need to shift our thinking first to see these kinds of conversations as a priority. And from there, we'll have the internal motivation to go find the support systems that we need to actually change our classrooms and our designs. And so last pieces here is just 2 slides. The next slide is some things that we're giving to you as an audience that you can kind of carry this conversation forward, but some material things that you can do, right? So we spoke about the reflective internal, but in a physical kind of manifestation, interpersonal or systemic sense, when we're thinking about the classroom, it's asking yourself, do I have the competencies to actually call out harm or call in harm when it is happening? Do I even know how to identify things like microaggressions, stereotypical discourse, devil's advocacy? And if the answer to that might be a resounding no, that would be the place to start. Begin to build your competency on these topics and drive a repertoire of responses, so you have a confidence to call out harm in the classroom rather than asking a student to do it on your behalf or to address it on your behalf. Also recognizing that the impact for that student is not only just spotlighting their experiences and unrecognized labor, but it often comes with reprisal, social exclusion, and other things. So giving and redirecting students that are also asking a lot of questions that you may not be able to handle from your own positionality to other materials, and not racialized students. It's okay to say, I don't know, let me parking lot that, let me go do some research and come back, rather than redirecting it onto somebody else who has less power, and be accountable to any mistakes or missteps. I think outside of the classroom is continuing to solicit that ongoing feedback, and really try to drive through stakeholder engagement, getting feedback, getting data, and utilizing that to try and provide opportunities, initiatives, interactions, and conversations with students that are experiencing the most harm. And to also think through how we may be able to reform things like our accommodations procedures, our mentorships, and shadowing, and more. And lastly, I think Maddie already spoke about this, but it's thinking about, how do I diversify my curriculum, right? Guest speakers, global perspectives in, the readings, decentering and challenging whiteness, trying to foster more group dialogue and group discussion, rather than you standing at the top there monologuing for 3 hours, right? About something you're really passionate about, but may not be resonating with half of the identities in the room. Frequently update your syllabi. If you're still utilizing a syllabi from your course from 2003, it's time to change it up. The landscape has changed, social issues has changed, research has changed, and students' appetite for things that are a bit more, I think, up to date and progressive, is there. And don't be afraid to apply a racial lens or an anti-oppressive lens to any conversation. So often when I go into, let's say, engineering and sciences, they're like, what does race have to do with the fact that we're in STEM? Like we're just looking at static things like numbers. And I ask them, think about the power and positionality of people who are in STEM research or in engineering. You are there creating services and products that ultimately affect marginalized populations, right? So from your own systems of thinking and theory that inform these stats and engineering and design, how do we actually also see what theories and design and infrastructure might actually be leaving people out, might actually be creating exclusive, products and services that then have impacts on communities in harmful ways. And so we'll pause here because I know we have some questions, but some resources you can, drive some of this conversation further. Maddie and I have published a lot of work based off of this project. So we're kind of, shamelessly self-plugging some of our own resources here, but there are also additional open access resource pages from McMaster that I've had a hand in co-designing. Maddie has had a hand in kind of, advising, or that we have utilized ourselves as rich resources to drive more of these practical tools, like how do you do the inclusive resource teaching page. The Chicago University guidebook for inclusive teaching is very, very rich, and a Flex Forward guide, which is focused on accessibility and specifically digital accessibility for diverse learners. And I'm thinking international students specifically, and designing your course in a way that can also be digestible for folks who are not born in this country is a really, really good resource. So we thank you for your time. We're going to pause and stop babbling here, and at least we've done our best to give about 5-ish minutes for questions. And I'll stop sharing so we can see your lovely faces and emojis and names.
I also put our contact information in the chat, so please feel free to email Renee and I anytime if you folks have to run, because I know we're 4 minutes from time.
Would you like to answer the question on the chat?
Yes, for sure. Renee, I can read it to you and we can chat about it. It's a great question. Thanks for pointing out the pre-COVID milestone for the research. That was quite significant. A lot has happened during/since COVID. Do you think your research results would be different if you conducted today post-American elections? A great question, one that we could literally probably spend a day talking about. But an important contextual piece is as we were starting to build the site, it was in the midst of the post kind of context after George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police, and there was a surge in Black Lives Matter organizing. So that was a really important contextual piece for, I think, some of the momentum that we gained actually building the site and having institutional interest. It resulted in Renee and I being called into a lot of consultation spaces with deans and with provosts around EDI related work. Renee could probably speak about this endlessly, but we're now seeing the pendulum shift again, and there's a real attack on EDI work. Renee is in the Equity and Inclusion Office at McMaster. I co-chair the Gender and Sexuality Working Group at McMaster, so we're seeing also a very steep rise in anti-trans hate, which is getting very concerning. So I think absolutely the research would look different, and I think in a perfect world, Renee and I would love to do this again and continue to build on it. But our biggest challenge has been sustainability. We're both students. We're both now currently pursuing full-time work. So if we were ever in the position where we were more permanently situated at the university, I think we both would be really excited to revive this project and expand upon it. And there's a lot of interest from specifically educational developers, Renee, I think, in doing that work. But yeah, I think long and short of it is it would be really, really different. And I think we kind of need that insight now because we're seeing the pendulum shift and we need to see where people are at and how it's affecting people on the ground. So Renee, I don't know if you wanted to add anything or if there were other questions.
Yeah, I just want to contextualize the use of the word different, because I don't think the themes that come in this new world would be different itself. I think they would actually just be richer. And I think it would reveal more intersectional experiences, because we were really just focused on a singular identity of you as a racialized person. As Maddie mentioned, we didn't really ask you to grapple with your other intersections. You're not just racialized. You could have gendered positionality. You could have a positionality of being an international student, disability, things of that sort. So I've noticed since COVID, the push now of this type of research, anti-racism research within pedagogical places, to be really focused on unveiling the interlocking, intersectional kind of discrimination that people of color are experiencing, and really giving, I think, a bit more breadth to what would anti-racist CRIP informed, let's say, pedagogical changes look like. That's its own conversation versus an anti-racist queer kind of informed pedagogical change. So I think we would get, again, further disaggregated and a bit more intersectional in terms of the richness of themes and results.
Probably in the last minute, Renee, if you want to help answer this one. And then again, if there are any other questions, please just email us. We were saying to Anna and Juan that we could probably do like a full several day workshop if we wanted to. But can you speak to the experiences of racialized and non-racialized students in response to learning in color? For context, I work in a department where there's a lot of resistance and apathy in the student culture to EDIA initiatives. So I always think about how to help drive that transformational change. Yeah, it's a really great question. Renee, any thoughts on that one?
Yes. So I think overwhelmingly, I would say, or generally speaking, it's been a good and positive response. And even just outside of students, in terms of us shopping this around to instructors, it's been well received in some administrators. However, and it is dependent on, I think, who and the philosophy and the culture of that department. So for example, we've noticed a significant uptake of this by students, whether they're racialized or non-racialized, in social sciences and humanities. But that's also because philosophically, that attracts a particular type of student that is already somewhat primed or ready or interested in trying to dig into these types of conversations and social, kind of trends and identities. I would say that there has been a little bit more recently of an uptake of this in health sciences and sciences, just because they've been recently interested in, like broadly in terms of tri-council research, motivating this kind of philosophic trend in blending equity and healthcare and, in science. But I've noticed significant resistance of really meaningfully engaging with this, unless you are an instructor of color yourself, passionate about this type of work, or a student of color yourself in engineering and STEM topics, if I'm being very, very frank, and some other interdisciplinary studies. And so that's where I would say that when there's a bit of a difference in terms of philosophic orientation to some of these things, integrating it into the classroom and trying to tell students, particularly white students, why this is meaningful is a bit of a task. And when I have these conversations with people who are working in some of those faculties where they're noticing the socializing around this conversation is difficult, I tell them, you need somebody in a more powerful position to paint why this conversation is needed. So for example, in engineering now, there's been a trend or shift rather in McMaster towards anti-racism that has been sparked by new leadership, such as their dean and an EDI committee, within sciences and engineering. And so now that students are able to see that ideological modeling from like the top power in the faculty, they're like, maybe this is something that I should be interested in, or that I should be learning a little bit more about. So I have noticed that bit of a difference, if I have to be completely frank. Yeah.
We are lamentably past the top of the hour, so we need to let people go. But I would stay with you all afternoon, discussing these topics. I am in sciences and so I hear what you are saying. But I don't know, Anne, is there anything you want to add before we end the call?
I would just repeat what everybody's saying in the chat and what you've already said, Juan Carlos. Thank you both so very much. What a rich and full presentation with a lot in it for lots of reflection from all of us. I would love to keep talking about how you move this into these kinds of self-reflection and pedagogical practice into those exactly engineering and those other fields where people say, but the curriculum is this, right? And this is our like, oh, we have a vet school, right? This is the curriculum. I mean, you can't sort of change that. So anyways, another time and another session, perhaps. Thank you both very much. Thank you to everybody who came to this. I know that people are disappearing, so thanks to everyone who's left. That was fabulous. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you
all
very
so
much.
much.
Yeah.
Stay tuned, folks. There will be another one coming up shortly in another month or so. And we'll certainly get the word out about that one too.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.